At the time of this recording, we are approaching Christmas and Hanukkah. But this does raise an interesting question of what did the Egyptians think about holidays? And we're going to examine that issue today on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. In the ancient world, all holidays began as holy days or religious festivals. Every month contained religious festivals, and temples often contained and kept records of elaborate calendars used to record their festivals. For example, the festival calendar at Abydos mentions no less than 15 festivals during the first 4 months of inundation alone. In ancient Egypt, people were not normally given days off. The typical work week was 10 work days. 9.5 of those you worked, and you got a half day off. But you didn't normally get a full day off. However, sometimes an exception was made to give a full day off for a religious festival. And this was done so that the person could make offerings to their gods or to celebrate certain religious observances. And we see this in Ostraca, British Museum 5634, which notes a certain worker taking several days off for religious festivals. Now, when we talk about festivals in ancient Egypt, most religious festivals included some sort of procession. And what we mean by a procession is, say, a religious parade. Now, we still have religious processions today. We see them at weddings and funerals. In the case of a wedding, the bride walks down the aisle as a kind of procession. As far as a funeral goes, the dead are often placed into, say, a caravan of hearses and then slowly drive to the cemetery. So we still have processions in modern society, although we don't really couch them as much in religious terms. Now, at the center of most temples in ancient Egypt was a shrine. And in that shrine, the god of that particular temple ruled as if from a throne. Now, often this shrine was styled like a model boat, which was called a sacred bark. During festival days, the sacred bark was covered in strands of beads and wreaths of flowers. Then priests carried the bark with the statue of the god out of the temple so that the god could interact with the common person. As the bark traveled outside of the temple and came in contact with the average person, the people would invariably ask their most deep questions to the gods. And it's interesting here, we have accounts where, say, the god would then respond. So people would ask their questions of these gods inside the sacred barks, and we are told in the text that the god would respond by shaking their bark one way for yes and another way for no. So people were able to get simple yes or no questions answered directly from the god himself when it went on procession. Also during these events, other priests would escort the barks and hand out food that had been offered to the gods. And this became sort of an act of beneficence. In Egyptian structure, much of the distribution of food had gone through the temples. Essentially, the king had huge allotments of land, which were cultivated, turned into offerings that were then given to the gods. Those offerings were collected, and then the priests would then distribute them to other priests and people, etc. At these festivals, sort of the middleman was cut out, and the offerings were given directly from the gods to the people. So the people regarded these events as, exceptionally festive events because they got to eat directly of the food of the gods. Now, the greatest of these festivals in Egypt was called the Opet festival, and Opet comes from the word meaning Karnak. This festival began at Karnak Temple, and Karnak Temple was the temple of the Theban triad, the gods Amun-Re, Mut, and Khonsu. And these three gods were the core of religion at Thebes, at Karnak. So the Opet festival began with a procession of 3 sacred barks. Later on, it would be expanded to several more. But early on, it was just the 3. And these 3 boats would leave Karnak Temple, go onto a wharf and onto a barge, and sail up the river to Luxor Temple. At Luxor Temple, these barks would stay for a while and then go on procession again, but this time over land. They would travel down a processional causeway of sphinxes back to Karnak Temple, essentially doing one big circle from Karnak to Luxor and back again. In ancient Egypt, gods were typically sequestered in sacred space. Gods were considered to be creatures that only would stay in their idols if those idols were constantly surrounded by sacred space. And everything outside of the temple was considered to be profane space. Essentially, space that is defiled, that a god cannot stand to reside in. Because we have in Egyptian sacred architecture this dichotomy between sacred and profane, the temple also came to represent a dichotomy between earthly and heavenly realms. The center of the temple, the sacred part, was considered to be an extension of heaven, while outside the temple was considered to be part of the earthly realm. So the way a temple normally worked was gods stayed sequestered inside sacred space and couldn't leave. Likewise, people who were profane and weren't ritually purified couldn't enter. Now, one of the interesting things that religious processions did was it inverted that order. These gods, who could not stay in profane space, had their statues, and we have to remember that the statue of a god was considered to be the flesh and body of the manifestation of the god himself. So the priest would take that idol, stick it in a sacred bark. Now, a sacred bark was nothing more than a miniature temple. It had its own form of sacred space. So think of it kind of like a space capsule, where you put the god into the space capsule, and now the sacred bark can leave the temple and basically take a piece of his sacred environment with him as he goes out into profane or defiled space. So the god can travel among the people without being defiled by the profane space that's outside the temple itself. This had the consequence of showing that everything was working normally through this very, very interesting inversion of temple theology. So when the sacred barks left the temple, the people received the visitation of the god through an interactive incarnational lens. So we have to understand that people were never allowed in the temples. Your average person never went in a temple. This isn't church. This is not church. People did not go to temple once a week normally. They were excluded. They were outside the process. They were not allowed to enter the temple. So festivals provided an opportunity for the god to come to them. This had the effect that when people saw these sacred barks on procession, it provided confirmation that their god really existed by showing them, hey, here's the god right here in front of me. I can see him. I can see his bark. And when I ask him questions, he responds and he notices me. This is one of the reasons why Egyptian religion managed to survive as long as it did, because it did provide an incarnational way of people relating to their god. Now, ultimately, these processions demonstrated that the king was still in control. One of the effects of these processions was that they could only sort of take place when you had law and order in the land. Because we have to remember when these processions took place, that sacred barks were covered in gold, they were covered in precious beads, precious stones. They were very, very valuable objects. And there were times of disorder and lawlessness in Egypt when the sacred barks could not go on procession, that the processions had to shut down for certain reasons. Essentially, that the sacred barks couldn't leave their temples. And it was during these times that the king was seen to have lost control over the country. Essentially, when the king could not guarantee the safety of these religious processions, he couldn't guarantee the safety of anyone else. He was not in control, his army wasn't in control, and foreigners could potentially rampage through the land, taking whatever they wanted. So the religious festivals were inextricably tied to the competency and the authority of the king himself. So this was a very, very important social function of these processions, that they affirmed the authority of the king and his control, and essentially gave the people a kind of security that the king could protect them. Now, one of the interesting things about bark processions, like the Opet festival, is that some bark processions are still practiced today in the modern world. Muslims at Luxor Temple celebrate a festival that parades the boats of the Muslim saint Sheikh Yusuf al-Hagag. And if you're lucky enough to be near Luxor Temple at the time of the al-Hagag festival, you can see these little boats being constructed and then taken on a procession or parade in celebration of this Muslim saint. However, the origins of this festival originate with the Opet festival found at Karnak and Luxor. Now, holidays in Egypt were not just for parading gods before the people. There were other festivals that served other purposes as well. One of the most famous of these is the Heb-Sed festival, that was celebrated when a king had reached his 30th regnal year. It was celebrated to ritually reenact and restore the vitality of the king. And it was never practiced until that 30th year had been reached, and then every 2 years thereafter. And the purpose of it was to ensure that the king could continue to competently rule, and that the kingdom remained profitable and safe. During this festival, the king was forced to do a running race and an obstacle course to show his vitality. And interestingly enough, there's no exception to age here. A 90-year-old king would still be forced to run the race and obstacle course, although we have no records as to how fast he managed to complete the race. However, suffice it to say, he did have to complete it. Another festival that was really important was the Festival of the Valley. Now, this is the festival where people visited the tombs of their ancestors, going back usually 1 or 2 generations. The descendants of the dead would bring picnic baskets to the tombs of their ancestors. And the living would have a picnic and talk to the dead. There would also usually be music and dancing in the courtyard of the tombs. Now, today, people in Egypt still do visit the tombs of their ancestors and still do bring a picnic lunch to celebrate their ancestors and to talk with the deceased. So here's another sort of remnant of the festival of ancient Egypt. We also have festivals that celebrated the beginning of the lunar month. Egypt had both a lunar calendar and a civil calendar. And the civil calendar was based upon the month being 30 days, whereas the lunar calendar tended to follow the natural cycle of the moon. So the two calendars tended to fall out of sync with each other. In the records that we have of, say, festivals in ancient Egypt, most festivals are synchronized with the civil calendar. However, there were still some festivals that were based upon, say, astronomical events, such as the lunar calendar, that were not included in the recorded calendars, but were still nonetheless practiced. Overall, festivals and holidays were important to the social and religious fabric of Egypt. The Egyptians used ritual as a force to stabilize society. And by reenacting annual ritual observances, ritual still performs the same functions for us today. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something. And I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.